Margaret Hayes stood before the bathroom mirror on the morning of her 53rd birthday, studying the silver threading through her auburn hair, the lines etched around her eyes like a map of every smile and sorrow. The dating app on her phone had gone silent weeks ago. The last message she'd received was from a man who seemed promising until he admitted he was actually looking for someone closer to his daughter's age. "You understand?" he'd written, as if rejection at 53 was easier to swallow than at 23. She deleted the app and decided that perhaps she'd had her chance at love. Some people got one great romance in their lifetime, and she'd had hers with David, who'd died 7 years ago, leaving her with memories in an empty house that echoed. Her friends meant well with their encouragements and their setups with divorced colleagues who wanted women who could still give them children, or who treated 50-something women like placeholders until someone younger came along. Margaret had watched their faces change when they learned her age, watched interest dim like a candle starved of oxygen. Too old for adventure. Too old for passion. Too old for new beginnings. She'd started to believe it herself, started to shrink into the narrative that society had written for women like her. She'd built a good life anyway. She taught English literature at the community college, took pottery classes on weekends, volunteered at the animal shelter, and told herself that fulfillment came in many forms. But sometimes, in the quiet hours between dinner and sleep, she felt the weight of all that unlived life pressing against her chest. She wanted someone to share morning coffee with, someone to debate politics and poetry with. Someone who'd hold her hand during scary movies even though they were both too old to admit they were frightened. The rancher's horse appeared at the shelter on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The mare was malnourished, her ribs showing through dull coat, one leg injured and infected. Margaret was there sorting donation supplies when the animal control officer brought her in. Behind the trailer came a battered pickup truck, and out stepped a man who looked as broken as his horse. He was somewhere in his late 50s, tall and weathered, with eyes that held the kind of pain that comes from watching something you love suffer. His name was Coleman Reed, and he'd been a rancher before drought and debt had taken everything. He'd held on to his horses until the very end, but when he could no longer feed them, he'd made the hardest call of his life. Now he came to the shelter every day to check on the mare, to sit with her, to whisper apologies she couldn't understand but seemed to feel anyway. Margaret noticed him because he was always there when she arrived for her evening volunteer shift. He never asked for anything, never made conversation, just sat on an overturned bucket beside the mare's stall with his weathered hands gentle on her neck. One evening, Margaret brought 2 cups of coffee from the break room. She handed him one without asking if he wanted it, and he accepted without questioning why. They sat in silence for 20 minutes before he finally spoke. "I failed her," he said simply. "I promised I'd take care of them all, and I couldn't." Margaret understood something about broken promises and lives that didn't turn out as planned. "You brought her here," she replied. "That wasn't failure. That was love making an impossible choice." Their conversations became the rhythm of Margaret's weeks. Coleman would be there in the evenings, and she'd bring coffee, and they'd talk about everything and nothing. He told her about the ranch, about watching 5 generations of work disappear under the auctioneer's gavel, about starting over at 58 with nothing but a social security check and part-time work at a feed store. She told him about David, about how grief eventually becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you, about her students and her pottery and the strange loneliness of being invisible. One evening, as autumn turned toward winter, Coleman said something that changed everything. "My daughter called yesterday. She wants to set me up with her friend's mother. Nice woman, she says, 52. He paused, his coffee cup balanced on his knee. "I told her I wasn't interested." Margaret felt something twist in her chest, though she wasn't sure why. "Why not?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Because I've spent 3 months sitting with the most interesting woman I've ever met, and I'm fairly certain I'm falling in love with her." He said it plainly, without poetry or pretense. The way he did everything. "My daughter thinks I should want someone younger, someone who hasn't lived yet. But Margaret, I don't want someone who hasn't lived. I want someone who's survived their own storms and knows what it means to rebuild. I want someone who understands that love at our age isn't about perfect bodies or endless time. It's about finding someone whose scars fit against yours, whose past makes sense alongside your own." Margaret set down her coffee cup because her hands were shaken. For 3 months, she'd been telling herself this was friendship, that men like Coleman didn't see women like her as anything more. She'd been preparing herself for the inevitable moment when he'd mention a girlfriend or a date or an interest in someone age-appropriate by society's cruel standards. "I'm 53, she said, and it sounded like a confession. "Everyone says that's too old. Too old for romance. Too old for passion. Too old for new chapters." Coleman reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, warm and solid. "Then everyone's a damn fool," he said. "You're not too old, Margaret, you're exactly right. You're interesting and kind, and you see the world with eyes that have earned their wisdom. You make me want to believe in second chances." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on her wrist. You're perfect for me. If you have a broken-down rancher with more debts than prospects and a heart that has been kicked around by life. Margaret felt tears. She didn't know she'd been holding spilled down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness, but of relief, of recognition, of finding someone who saw her completely and didn't look away. I am a 53-year-old English teacher with student loans and a house that needs repairs and stretch marks and gray hair. She whispered, I'm nobody's idea of perfect. You're mine, Coleman said simply. And in that moment, sitting in a horse shelter on a cold November evening, Margaret understood that the right person doesn't arrive despite your age, or your history, or your scars. The right person arrives because of them. Seeing in your weathered landscape the evidence of survival, strength, and a heart that's learned how to love despite loss. Sometimes perfect isn't young, or flawless, or untouched by time. Sometimes perfect is simply being exactly who you are, for someone who is brave enough to be exactly who they are in return.